to start off, I just wanted to give you all a little bit about my background. Um, I am a trained journalist. I went to Kent State University, got my degree in journalism, went back to Kent State, got my master's in family life education. Um, Around the time I was in grad school, I started doing a ton of work with moms and other women in my community, and I became a self-care coach, really making it my day job to host workshops like this, to create spaces and environments for mostly Black women and women of color to kind of
Yeah.
analyze, um,
Well, I
to
still have
analyze
that
what
book
we're
here.
doing, how we
I
can
have to
do it
borrow
better,
it
and
sometime,
how
so.
we can create lives that are less busy, less fuzzy and unfocused, and really get to the point of our exhaustion and stress. More recently, I have joined my local school district's DEI executive board, which means for roughly 2 to 3 times per month, I'm in meetings with the superintendent, Board of Education members, other parents, teachers, um, guidance counselors, all types of people in this background. And what we're doing is we are working to make our district more equitable, more inclusive, and more diverse. In doing this work, because I am not a member of the staff, because I am, there as a community member, as a parent, my job is really figuring out how do we engage parents in our community? How do we bring them into the work that we're doing? And, I've been working on this for close to a year now. And so it's really, this presentation is really about the work that I've been doing on the DEI board. I really welcome any questions that you all have. I don't want you to feel like this is a space where it's just time for you to listen, but it's really important for us to have conversations. So if you have any questions, I have the chat up. I know Liz and Josh will be there to help me kind of moderate. But if you have questions about anything that I'm saying at any point, you can either drop them in the chat, or you can, raise your hand, or, use the raise hand function, and we can really just talk about it. Coming into this, I also want you to know that I do have 2 children. My children are 14 and 12, which I have a hard time believing some days because it just seems like I just had them. But yeah, I'm here because I am a Black mom. I want this world to be a better, more equitable place for my children. And I'm happy to do workshops like this to help us all figure out how we can do this better. One thing that I want to note before I jump into just some quick tips and things that I really want to share. This is a space where you have to be open, and you have to be curious. I think those are the 2 things that I would ask of you. I also want you to look at this as something that is central to your parenting. Just in the same way that, thinking about what your children eat, what books they read, what reading level they're at, being an inclusive parent, thinking about how to raise anti-racist children, it's all central. It's all something that we can do. There's plenty of resources out there that will help us. And this call hopefully will be a great start for those of us who are trying to figure out where do I start, okay? So the first thing, I have 5, is it 5? Yeah. 5 just quick tips that I want to go through, and then we can kind of start our conversation. Or, if you have any questions anytime, drop those in the chat. So the first is to examine your own bias and knowledge gaps. I think it's important as parents that we recognize where our own bias lies. Even as a Black woman, I have my own biases, and I, try to interrogate them and really delve into them as much as I can. But I feel like we all have these kind of blind spots where we're not necessarily as knowledgeable or as aware as we could be. For those of you, I'm guessing that a lot of you on this call have probably been engaged with some type of implicit bias training or implicit bias work. You may be familiar with the term. If not, Harvard has a number of implicit bias tests that will just kind of test um, what your preferences are. Are you, do you have a slight preference or moderate preference for people who are fat or skinny or transgender or cisgender, light skin, dark skin, etc. So I think that those tests are a great place to start. And they do give you some insight as to, how deep those biases are, how ingrained they are in you, if it's moderate or slight. But one thing that I want us to do is to go a step further and not just see where your biases lie, but how did they grow? How did they begin? And so that requires looking back at your own life, looking back at what did your parents teach you. And I know it can be kind of difficult to examine, how your parents were raised and how they raised you, but that's crucial to go back and think about, how did your parents raise you? What were some things that you heard them say growing up? Was there any instances where you saw them be perhaps discriminatory, or you know that there was never, anybody outside of your race that came to your house growing up? Thinking about your classmates, thinking about your friends, people that you grew up with, were they all, kind of the same circle as you, all had the same gender, all had the same race, all had the same religious affiliation? Thinking about those things, thinking about your teachers. Did you have teachers, growing up K through 12, and even maybe going, if you went to college, did they all look like you? What classes did you take? What electives did you take? And in looking at your whole cultural history, looking at that, you'll begin to see where your own biases may have started and where those knowledge gaps lie. Full disclosure, one of the things that I'm working on personally is my knowledge of Indigenous issues. For me, I read a book by Tommy Orange called There There. If any of you are interested in learning more about Indigenous cultures and peoples, I highly recommend that book because it is a look at modern urban Indigenous people, which is not something that we get a lot of in this society. A lot of our work around or knowledge around Indigenous cultures is really based in the past and settlers and colonialism. But looking at what the Indigenous people go through today, and looking, even though his book is a work of fiction, a lot of it is based in actual facts, kind of historical fiction. And so I have my own, knowledge gaps. And I recognize that even though I live in Ohio, right? Think about that word, Ohio. I grew up in Cuyahoga County. That's an Indigenous word. Erie, is right by us. I live in this area with so much Indigenous culture and history, and I knew maybe 2% of it. And so I'm working now to understand that I don't know everything about everything, but I'm able to recognize those things that I don't know. And instead of looking at it, kicking myself and being upset that I didn't know it before, I'm just moving and giving myself grace and getting in the game now. Somebody told me this a while ago, that you are your child's first university. And that stuck with me. I think my children were toddlers. So close to a decade ago, you are your child's first university. And I'm really want to hammer home that point, because when you look at your knowledge gaps and you examine your biases, then you have to make sure that you try to plug those gaps and really try to encourage yourself and dive deeper and learn more, and examine these areas where your knowledge gaps lie. And so the second part of this is to let your children see you learn. So if you are picking up, for example, they're there, reading that and asking, talking to them about it. If you are, doing an implicit bias test, I went on there today just to see, because I knew they had one on race. I knew that they had an implicit bias test on light skin, dark skin. I think I knew that they had one on age, but they had one on transgender issues. They had one on weight. They had one on religion. They had one on weapons, which I didn't quite get that one. I have to go back and investigate that. Um, but my son saw me looking at the website today, and he wanted to try, and so he took an implicit bias test on age, I think, and it came out that he had a moderate um, moderate preference for young versus old faces. So that is an example of letting your children see you learn. It's really about, you engaging in that work, but then also they see you engaging in it. It's not something that you kind of do in the shadows and you only pull it out when you're ready and you know all of the correct terminology and you feel like you're an expert, you feel like you have a PhD in critical race theory. That's not necessary. It's really, about learning and growing together and not being afraid to show with your kids, that you are trying to learn more about a specific people or culture and bringing them into the fold. Um, there's two resources that I think are highly valuable because they not only allow you to learn, but it's you and your kids alongside one another. So the first one is the Conscious Kid. And that is a Patreon account, which you can get access to. I believe its lowest tier is $1 a month. Um, and they give out, it's a really rich resource for caregivers who are looking for, and yes, they do have an amazing Instagram. Um, for caregivers who are looking for activities, ideas, um, just more information so that you can learn and you can help yourself become more engaged with some of these topics, a more vocal anti-racist, to have research and facts at your disposal. So when you're talking about these things, you sound like you know what you're talking about. So the Conscious Kid is one. The second one that I would recommend, and I personally know her, but even if I didn't, I would still recommend it, is Mama Demics. Mama Demics has won a Patreon, and I want to say her lowest one is either $1 or $5 a month, but don't quote me. But Mama Demics also has a series called Raising an Advocate. Her Raising an Advocate series, I believe she's been doing it maybe about 5 years or so now. And her Raising an Advocate series has a ton of blog posts, activities, just an amazing amount of resources for caregivers who are looking to raise an advocate. Is right there in the title. One of my favorite things that she does is that she, in one of the, I don't know if it was one of the more recent posts that she posted, but she had one on Dr. Seuss. And there's a big push in some communities to cancel Dr. Seuss because he had some racist cartooning in his past and blackface, and there's some not so great stuff in the archives. Um, but what she was outlining, and if you were a parent who's engaged in anti-racism work and you saw this, you might say, oh no, I have to get rid of green eggs and ham. I have to get rid of, the places that we go. But what she did through her blog post was really break down, how you can share that with your children. You can share how we grow, how we learn. He started here with blackface and some racist cartooning, and then he moved on, and his ideas and his views evolved. And then he made, the Lorax and the Sneetches and all of these other books that really talk about accepting people and not being discriminatory and environmental justice, all types of things. And so I think those two resources, the Conscious Kid and Mama Demics, her Raising an Advocate series, those two I think are two main go-to sources for me when I need, to stretch my thinking on something, if I want to just really have a steady diet of some of this material, have a steady diet of some of this thinking, because it takes effort to unlearn what we've learned. And if we don't put in that effort, if we don't have that steady diet of something that's telling us different, if we just kind of stay in our own echo chambers, we won't hear it, we won't see the growth, and we won't be able to then pass that growth down to our children. And thank you, Liz, for dropping the links and everything in the chat. I really appreciate it. And yes, Disney has those disclaimers as well. I think I saw it on Dumbo, maybe. I can't remember which one, but yes, Peter Pan as well. This next one, I think, is one of my favorite ones. Thinking about examining the media you consume and the money that you spend. Because those two things, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, your leisure time, I should say, and how you spend your money, that reflects your personal values. So thinking about your favorite TV shows, how many of them have an all-white cast? How many of them have an all-white writer's room? How many of them have a on networks where the majority of the programming is all white? Thinking about your podcasts that you listen to, thinking about your children, if they're old enough to be on YouTube, what channels do they watch? Do they tend to only watch people who look just like them or have the same lives as them? How can we expand that? When you are shopping, I know a lot of us, it's very easy to just go on Amazon and click add to cart and get it there, sometimes that same day. I know it is very easy to do that. And my Amazon shopping during the pandemic has been outrageous. I know. But also, when you go to spend your money, how often do you buy from a Black-owned business or a business owned by a queer owner? How often do you shop with Indigenous people? Thinking about that, thinking about when you do go online and say you do shop at some of these boutiques, those people that you buy from, what do their websites look like? The models that they use. Just thinking about all of the ways that you consume things, you go through the world and you spend money. And you just want to make sure that how you do those things and your personal values are in alignment. If you want to have a world where everybody can be successful in business, people's stories are being told, there's representation on your TV from all different aspects. If that's what you want, then you have to make sure that the way that you're consuming media and the way that you're spending money, that those also align. The next thing, and I think this is the hardest thing, I had to have a conversation with my dad about this because language is changing so rapidly. And I was trying to explain, my father's he's a teacher. He teaches in a nursing school. And I had to explain pronouns to my father and just really try to explain why, he always calls his students Mr. or Mrs. last name. That's his go-to. He enjoys that. And then I had to remind him, not to assume gender or to assume, just by gender expression, to assume gender from that. And so, he had to sit back and say, okay, well then how, what do I, call people, or how do I reevaluate how I operate in the classroom? Because he doesn't want to be, he wants to promote, that they are welcome, that they are, valued members of his class. And so I said, well, when you speak to everybody, instead of ladies and gentlemen, you could just say y'all, or you can say, I love folks, that's my go-to. So just thinking about the ways that language is shifting, and if at all possible, it's very important to understand some of these changing languages and rules from that actual community. So I'm not going to say, I'm the standard bearer for, appropriate language around transgender issues because I'm cisgender. So I'm not going to be upfront like that. So I would look to somebody in the trans community that I know, and either ask them or research on Google or find some trusted source where I can say, okay, boom, this is how I will, speak about, certain topics. Um, Also, just a point, if anybody is having wants to kind of expand their mind, expand their thinking, they're not quite great with trans issues. Janet Mock's memoir, um, that really, I mean, shifted everything for me. It really gave me a much clearer understanding of trans people and their, needs and their desires and, how they want to move through the world. So I just had to say that because I always recommend her book whenever I'm speaking to people. And it just really gave me such a clarity that I didn't even know, again, going back to number one, I didn't even know I had, a knowledge gap around that until I read her book. So Janet Mock's memoir, she has two. The first one, Redefining Realness, is the one that I'm recommending. And thanks, Liz, again. You are so, you're on it. Thank you so much. So grasping the language, thinking about pronouns, thinking about, ways that you can be inclusive with your language, I think is really crucial because this is also the language that your children are growing up hearing.